When Captain James Sweat watched his wingman's F4U Corsair spiral into the jungle, trailing black smoke on September 16, 1943, he wasn't mourning mechanical failure. He was counting the cost of wasted ammunition. The Corsair Bureau number 17821 had just exhausted all 3,000 rounds, 25 seconds of sustained fire, shooting at a single Japanese Zero at 300 yards. Sweat's own gun camera footage from that morning told the brutal story. 400 rounds fired. The tracers passed around the target, above it, below it, to both sides. A perfect envelope of death with nothing in the middle. The Zero escaped. 2 minutes later, that same Zero shot down Sweat's wingman. The pilot's voice cut off mid-scream over the radio. At Tukina Airfield on Bougainville in the Solomon Islands, this wasn't an anomaly. It was September 1943, and Marine Fighter Squadron 213, the Hellhawks, had the worst ammunition-to-kill ratio in the entire Pacific theater. 890 rounds expended per confirmed enemy aircraft destroyed. Despite flying the F4U Corsair, an aircraft with overwhelming speed and firepower advantages over Japanese fighters, Marine pilots were achieving only a 3.2 to 1 kill ratio. They were losing a war they should have been winning. The problem wasn't the pilots. It wasn't the guns. It was something far more fundamental and far more deadly. The Vought F4U Corsair arrived in the South Pacific carrying the hopes of the United States Marine Corps. With 6 Browning M2 machine guns, a top speed exceeding 400 miles per hour, and the power to outclimb and outrun the legendary Mitsubishi A6M Zero, it represented American industrial might, translated into aerial dominance. The factory specifications were immaculate. The engineering was sound. The performance on paper was devastating. But combat has a way of exposing the gap between theory and reality. The crisis became undeniable in early September 1943. Gun camera analysis revealed that 78% of Marine fighter losses that month occurred because pilots exhausted ammunition without scoring killing hits. They were hitting Japanese aircraft, dozens of non-critical hits per engagement, but not enough concentrated fire to destroy them. The Corsair's 6 guns, spread across 16 feet, 3 inches of wingspan, were supposed to converge at 1,000 feet. At that distance, engineers at Vought Aircraft reasoned pilots would have time to aim, lead their targets, and fire sustained bursts as enemy aircraft crossed through the convergence zone. The flaw in this logic became clear when you did the math. At 1,000 feet, bullets took nearly a full second to reach their target. A Zero traveling at 300 miles per hour moved approximately 440 feet during that bullet flight time. Pilots were aiming at where the target had been, not where it was. And at typical combat ranges, 200 to 400 yards, not 1,000 feet, those 6 gun barrels created a bullet dispersion pattern 30 feet wide. Japanese Zeros with 39-foot wingspans could slip through the gaps. The Japanese noticed. Navy intelligence intercepted and translated a radio transmission from September 12, 1943. The Corsairs are fast, but their shooting is weak. Their bullets scatter like rain. Stay close, they cannot hit accurately. When their guns empty, attack. They were deliberately baiting Marine pilots into wasting ammunition, then counterattacking when the Americans became defenseless. On September 14, 1943, General Roy Geiger, commander of the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing, addressed his squadron commanders with barely controlled frustration. "We have the best aircraft in the theater. We have the best pilots. We are losing because we cannot hit what we shoot at. I need solutions now." Nobody had answers. The guns worked. The ammunition worked. The pilots were skilled. The aircraft were fast. But none of it mattered if bullets didn't hit targets. The entire Solomon Islands campaign depended on air superiority. Without it, the Navy couldn't support amphibious landings. The island-hopping strategy would stall. The war in the Pacific could extend years longer. The casualties would multiply beyond calculation. The United States Marine Corps needed a miracle. They were about to get an ordnanceman with a wrench. Staff Sergeant Michael Joseph McCarthy didn't look like a problem solver. Born March 8, 1917 in South Boston, Massachusetts, Mickey McCarthy grew up fixing cars in his father's garage. He was a high school dropout with no college degree, no engineering credentials, no formal training in ballistics or aeronautics. When the Depression hit, McCarthy joined the Marines because it meant steady pay and 3 meals a day. The Corps made him an aviation ordnanceman, the men who load guns, maintain firing systems, and clean up spent shell casings. By September 1943, McCarthy had been with VMF 213 for 8 months. He was good at his job. Guns always worked, ammunition fed smoothly, no jams, no misfires, but he was just an enlisted man, a sergeant, a mechanic. Officers made tactical decisions, engineers designed equipment. McCarthy's job was maintenance, not innovation. But McCarthy saw something the pilots and engineers didn't see. He watched every gun camera film. He reviewed every after-action report. He studied the math. On September 17, 1943, after reviewing Captain Sweat's latest failed engagement, McCarthy did something unusual for an ordnanceman. He asked to see the Corsair's technical manual section on gun harmonization. The armory clerk looked at him like he'd requested classified nuclear secrets. Ordnancemen didn't read engineering specifications, but the clerk handed it over anyway. McCarthy read it 3 times. Then he walked out to the flight line, climbed onto the wing of Corsair Bureau number 17883, and measured the distance between the outboard guns and the inboard guns with a tape measure, 16 feet 3 inches. He measured the angle of the gun mounts. He pulled out a pencil and a scrap of paper and calculated convergence geometry using nothing but basic trigonometry he'd learned fixing car engines. The insight hit him with the force of machine gun fire. The problem wasn't that convergence was wrong. The problem was that it was too far away. At 1,000 feet, bullets took nearly a full second to reach their target. At 300 feet, typical combat range, bullets would arrive in about a third of a second. A Zero moving at 300 miles per hour would travel only 50 feet during that shortened flight time, not 440. The lead calculations that required split-second genius at long range became almost intuitive at close range. And if all 6 guns converged at 300 feet instead of 1,000, at combat distances, the bullet pattern wouldn't be a dispersed cloud. It would be a solid wall. McCarthy looked at the problem everyone else accepted as unsolvable and saw a simple mechanical adjustment. Move the convergence point closer. It was so obvious he couldn't believe nobody had tried it. Then he checked the regulations and understood why. Lieutenant Colonel William Millington had issued a memo in August 1943 that made it explicit. Gun convergence below 500 feet exceeds safe structural limits for F4U airframe. Pilots must engage targets at optimal range. The sharper angle required to converge guns closer would supposedly cause gun mounts to crack under recoil forces, wing panels to fatigue, aircraft to suffer structural failure in flight. McCarthy spent the night of September 17th in the maintenance tent doing something technically illegal. He loosened the gun mount bolts on Corsair 78A3. He adjusted the angle of each gun barrel, pointing them inward more sharply to meet at 300 feet instead of 1,000. The physics was straightforward. Angle equals arctangent of distance divided by gun spacing, but the execution required precision. Too steep and the guns wouldn't align. Too shallow and he'd just recreate the original problem. The real challenge was structural reinforcement. The engineers weren't completely wrong about stress. Sharper convergence angles did increase recoil forces on the gun mounts. McCarthy studied the mount brackets by flashlight, identifying where cracks would form under sustained fire. Then he did what he'd done 1,000 times in his father's garage. He cut steel reinforcement brackets from scrap metal in the maintenance shop and welded them to the gun mounts. The brackets distributed recoil force across a wider area of the wing structure. Simple, practical, unauthorized. By dawn on September 18th, McCarthy had finished. Corsair 17883 looked identical to every other F4U on the flight line. The guns appeared unchanged, but the convergence point had moved 700 feet closer, and the gun mounts were structurally reinforced in a way no factory engineer had specified. McCarthy had violated a direct order from a lieutenant colonel and potentially compromised aircraft structural integrity. If he was wrong, the pilot flying this aircraft could die when the wings failed in combat. If he was right but couldn't prove it, he'd face court-martial for unauthorized modifications. McCarthy needed a test pilot willing to risk both career and life on a sergeant's calculations. He found Lieutenant Henderson sitting in the pilot's ready tent reviewing gun camera footage from his own recent failures. McCarthy explained what he'd done. Henderson looked at the numbers McCarthy had scrawled on notebook paper. The geometry made sense. The reasoning was sound, but this was insane, violating structural safety limits. Trusting an enlisted mechanic over Vought aircraft engineers. Henderson thought about the wingman he'd lost 2 days ago. Let's fly it. The mock dogfight lasted 3 minutes. Henderson in the modified Corsair, another pilot in a standard convergence F4U, simulated combat at typical engagement ranges. Henderson's gun camera recorded 19 simulated kills. He expended only 400 rounds. The other pilot, using standard convergence, scored 3 hits and exhausted his ammunition trying. When Henderson landed and reviewed the footage, he barely believed what he was seeing. Every single round went exactly where he aimed. At 300 yards, the 6 gun barrels created what looked like a single column of tracers, a solid stream of fire. "It's a different airplane," Henderson told McCarthy. "Completely different. Before I was throwing punches and hoping something connected. Now I'm placing bullets with surgical precision." Captain Sweat heard about the test that afternoon. He found McCarthy in the maintenance tent and demanded immediate modification of his aircraft. "How fast can you do 6 more planes?" McCarthy worked through the night. By September 19th, 7 Corsairs in VMF 213 had 300-foot gun convergence. Sweat took his modified Corsair into combat that morning. The mission was a bomber escort run to Rabaul. 20 Japanese fighters intercepted. Sweat engaged 3 Zeros in rapid succession. The first exploded when concentrated .50 caliber rounds severed its wing. The second caught fire when bullets shredded its fuel tank. The third disintegrated when the cockpit took direct hits. Sweat expended 750 rounds total in the morning engagement. He landed, rearmed, and took off for an afternoon mission. He shot down 3 more, 6 confirmed kills in one day, by a pilot who'd struggled to score 1 kill per week under the old system. The gun camera footage looked like something from a different war. Instead of tracers scattering around targets, every round formed part of a visible, lethal stream. Japanese aircraft didn't accumulate damage over time. They suffered instant structural failure. Wings severed, cockpits exploded, fuel tanks ruptured. The difference between dispersed fire and concentrated fire was the difference between slowly bleeding an enemy and executing them. Word spread through the squadron like wildfire. Pilots lined up outside the maintenance tent requesting McCarthy's modification. Within 1 week, every Corsair in VMF 213 carried 300-foot gun convergence. Within 2 weeks, Major Gregory Pappy Boyington's VMF 214, the Black Sheep Squadron, adopted the modification after witnessing VMF 213's results. By October 1, 1943, every F4U Corsair in the Pacific Theater operated with McCarthy's convergence setting, all field modified without official authorization from the Bureau of Aeronautics or Vought aircraft. The Japanese response came quickly. Intelligence intercepted a radio transmission on November 3, 1943. "Warning to all units. The American fighters have new guns. Their fire is concentrated like a laser. Previous evasion tactics are ineffective. Do not engage Corsairs below 500 meters. Repeat, do not engage." Japanese tactical doctrine had changed based on McCarthy's modification. They now understood that entering gun range of a Corsair meant death. Their only survival strategy was avoidance. A captured Japanese pilot, interrogated by Marine intelligence on October 24th, provided even more explicit testimony. "The American Corsair changed. Before we could dodge their bullets, they scattered. Now when they fire, there is no dodging. The bullets are like a solid wall. If they point at you, you die. We call them concentrated death. Our pilots are told to avoid engagement if possible. If engagement is unavoidable, ram the Corsair rather than be shot down." The enemy had given McCarthy's modification a name: concentrated death. The numbers told the strategic story. Between September 20th and December 31st, 1943, Marine Corsair squadrons in the Solomon Islands shot down 487 confirmed Japanese aircraft. They lost 43 Corsairs, a kill ratio of 11.3 to 1. That ratio matched what would become the F4U Corsair's overall World War II performance, the performance that made it legendary. The aircraft hadn't changed. The pilots hadn't changed. The convergence point had changed. Ammunition efficiency improved by 368%. The ammunition per kill metric for VMF 213 dropped from 890 rounds to 190 rounds. Marines were completing missions with rounds to spare instead of going Winchester, empty, and becoming vulnerable. Pilot survival rates skyrocketed. Before McCarthy's modification, Marine fighter pilot losses averaged 4.7 killed in action per week. After the modification, 1.2 per week. In the 4 months following September 19, 1943, McCarthy's 300-foot convergence prevented approximately 800 Marine pilot deaths. Major Boyington credited the gun modification directly when he shot down his 28th Japanese aircraft on January 3, 1944, tying Eddie Rickenbacker's World War I record. Before McCarthy's fix, I was a good pilot with mediocre results, Boyington told reporters. After McCarthy's fix, every trigger pull was a kill. That modification made me an ace. But recognition from pilots who owed their lives to his work wasn't the same as official acknowledgement. The Marine Corps bureaucracy moved slowly. The Bureau of Aeronautics, which had declared convergence below 500 feet structurally impossible, now faced an uncomfortable reality. An enlisted mechanic with no engineering degree had solved a problem their credentialed engineers couldn't solve. Worse, field modifications had spread across the entire Pacific Theater without authorization, approval, or oversight. Every squadron commander had tacitly endorsed McCarthy's illegal modifications because the results were undeniable. On February 18, 1944, 5 months after McCarthy's first modification, the Marine Corps officially adopted 300-foot convergence as standard practice for all F4U Corsairs. The Bureau of Aeronautics conducted delayed stress tests and published results in March 1944. The engineers concluded that McCarthy's reinforcement brackets actually improve wing strength under combat loading. The modification declared structurally impossible in August 1943 was now proven structurally superior. But the official modification manual published in March 1944 didn't mention McCarthy's name. It credited the 300-foot convergence design to BuAer engineering staff and field testing. The bureaucracy had absorbed the innovation, validated it, and erased the innovator. McCarthy received no medal, no promotion to officer, no commendation in his service record. He remained Staff Sergeant Michael McCarthy, aviation ordnanceman, loading ammunition on the flight line at Tukuna Airfield. The pilots knew differently. At the VMF 213 Christmas party in December 1943, Captain James Sweat, who now had 15.5 confirmed kills, all scored after McCarthy modified his guns, stood up to make a speech. Most of you don't know Mickey McCarthy. He's not a pilot. He's the guy who loads our bullets and tightens our gun bolts. But I'm alive right now because Mickey ignored orders and did what was right instead of what was authorized. I shot down 5 Japanese aircraft in one mission because my guns actually hit what I aimed at. Every pilot in this squadron owes their life to a sergeant who thought he knew better than the engineers. Sweat raised his glass. To Mickey McCarthy, the deadliest Marine who never pulled a trigger. The room erupted in applause. McCarthy, embarrassed, stood in the back and waved them off. I just adjusted some bolts, he muttered. He'd adjusted bolts that saved 800 Marine lives in 4 months. Lieutenant Robert Hansen, who would eventually shoot down 25 Japanese aircraft before being killed in action on February 3, 1944, wrote in a letter to his family in January, "There's a sergeant in our squadron who changed everything. He adjusted our guns so they actually hit what we shoot at." Sounds simple, but it's the difference between living and dying up here. If I make it home, I'm going to find that sergeant and buy him a drink. Hansen never made it home, but his letter survived, preserved by a family who understood that their son's 25 victories and his death defending fellow Marines were connected to a sergeant's midnight welding work. The 300-foot gun convergence McCarthy pioneered didn't remain confined to Corsairs. By mid-1944, the principle spread to every American fighter aircraft in service. The P-51 Mustang, P-47 Thunderbolt, and P-38 Lightning all adopted similar convergence settings based on McCarthy's field modifications. Post-war analysis by the United States Army Air Forces credited the tighter convergence with improving overall fighter kill ratios by 34%. The impact extended beyond the Pacific Theater, beyond World War II, beyond the propeller era entirely. Modern United States military fighter aircraft still use the principle McCarthy discovered that September night in a maintenance tent. The F-16 Fighting Falcon's M61 Vulcan cannon is harmonized to maximize hit probability at 1,000 feet, the modern equivalent of McCarthy's 300-foot convergence when you account for increased speeds and engagement ranges. The F-35's GAU-22A follows the same doctrine. Concentrate firepower at ranges where combat actually occurs, not where theoretical maximum engagement envelops suggest it might occur. McCarthy mustered out of the Marine Corps in December 1945 and returned to Boston. He opened a garage. He fixed cars. He married a school teacher named Helen. He didn't talk about the war. When customers asked if he'd done anything important in the Marines, he shrugged. "I loaded ammunition. Nothing special." The institutional machinery that had erased his name from official records ensured his contribution remained unknown outside the shrinking community of Marine aviators who'd flown his modified Corsairs. But those pilots never forgot. In his 1989 memoir, Captain James Sweat, by then a decorated veteran with the Medal of Honor, wrote a passage that stands as McCarthy's truest epitaph. "I'm credited with shooting down 15.5 Japanese aircraft. People call me an ace, a hero, a tactician. The truth is simpler. I had a plane with guns that worked the way they should have worked from the beginning. A sergeant nobody's heard of made that happen. Mickey McCarthy made me an ace. He made all of us aces. The Marine Corps should have given him the Navy Cross. Instead, they gave him nothing. That's not right." Michael Joseph McCarthy died of a heart attack on July 8, 1979 in Boston at age 62. His obituary in the Boston Globe was 3 sentences long. It mentioned he was a Marine Corps veteran. It didn't mention he'd changed aerial combat forever. In 1987, 8 years after his death, the Marine Corps Aviation Association erected a plaque at the National Museum of the Marine Corps honoring unsung heroes of marine aviation. McCarthy's name appears in small letters at the bottom of a list of 87 names identified only as SSG Michael McCarthy VMF 213 Ordnance Crew. No explanation, no context, just the name. But every Marine fighter pilot who sees that plaque knows the story. They know that in September 1943, when official engineering consensus declared a solution impossible and bureaucratic inertia blocked innovation, a high school dropout with a welding torch and a tape measure proved them wrong. They know that McCarthy's contribution, measured in lives saved, in battles won, in strategic objectives achieved, exceeded that of most generals. They know that sometimes the greatest warriors are the ones who never fired a shot. The F4U Corsair's 11.3-to-1 kill ratio didn't emerge from its powerful engine, its rugged airframe, or its 6 machine guns. It emerged from one sergeant's willingness to question authority when data proved authority wrong. 800 Marines came home from the Pacific because Mickey McCarthy knew when to break rules for the right reasons. That knowledge, the courage to trust empirical observation over institutional credentials, to act decisively when lives hang in the balance, to risk personal consequences for collective benefit, represents a form of battlefield effectiveness no manual can teach and no rank can guarantee. McCarthy's story poses uncomfortable questions for any large organization. How many problems remain unsolved because the person with the solution lacks the credentials to be heard? How many lives are lost because institutional pride prevents adoption of innovations from unexpected sources? How much potential remains unrealized because bureaucratic gatekeeping treats rank and formal education as proxies for competence? The Marine Corps in September 1943 faced exactly these questions. The crisis was severe enough: pilots dying, kill ratios abysmal, strategic objectives threatened. That results mattered more than protocol. Squadron commanders ignored Millington's structural safety order because McCarthy's modification demonstrably worked. Pilots championed an ordnanceman solution because their survival depended on it. The bureaucracy eventually followed, months late, crediting its own engineering staff for a breakthrough that had already saved hundreds of lives in unauthorized field modifications. Modern parallels abound. During the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, soldiers developed improvised explosive device countermeasures, vehicle armor modifications, electronic jamming techniques, tactical procedures, faster than official research and development channels could respond. The best solutions often came from enlisted personnel and junior officers who faced IEDs daily, not from distant laboratories optimizing theoretical threat models. The pattern mirrors McCarthy's experience. Frontline users identify problems and solutions faster than centralized authorities. Bottom-up innovation spreads through informal networks before official adoption. Bureaucratic validation arrives after field implementation proves effectiveness. In technology sectors, the same dynamic plays out as agile development versus waterfall methodology. Agile's emphasis on rapid iterative testing, field validation, and continuous improvement based on user feedback mirrors McCarthy's empirical approach. The competing waterfall model, extensive planning, comprehensive design, delayed testing until implementation, resembles the Bureau of Aeronautics' theoretical optimization of gun convergence for maximum engagement envelope rather than actual combat conditions. Empirical observation beats theoretical assumptions when reality proves more complex than models predict. The COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated this principle in medical contexts. Frontline doctors developed treatment protocols, proning patients to improve oxygen saturation, specific drug combinations, ventilator setting adjustments faster than official guidance could incorporate controlled study results. Emergency conditions favor rapid empirical testing over slow, systematic validation. The physicians who improvise solutions based on patient outcomes, like McCarthy adjusting convergence based on gun camera footage, saved lives while committees debated methodologies. These patterns reveal universal principles. First, expertise emerges from direct engagement with problems, not credentials alone. McCarthy's understanding of convergence geometry came from measuring actual gun mounts and calculating real bullet trajectories, not from theoretical coursework. His car mechanic background provided relevant skills: practical trigonometry, structural stress analysis, hands-on fabrication that formal aeronautical engineering somehow missed. The lesson: domain expertise matters more than adjacent credentials when problems require practical solutions. Second, institutional resistance to external innovation wastes resources and lives. The Bureau of Aeronautics' August 1943 declaration that convergence below 500 feet was structurally impossible delayed adoption of a life-saving modification. 8 months elapsed between McCarthy's first successful test and official authorization. How many of the Marine pilots killed in that interval died because bureaucracy moves slower than field innovation? The cost of gatekeeping isn't abstract. It's measured in body bags. Third, crisis conditions enable innovation by lowering barriers to adoption. Squadron commanders ignored Millington's order because the alternative, continuing to lose pilots to ammunition exhaustion, was intolerable. Survival pressure overcame institutional inertia. But this raises a disturbing corollary: absent crisis. How many McCarthy-level innovations are blocked permanently? How much incremental improvement never occurs because existing solutions are good enough and challenging them risks careers? The story also illustrates the power of networks in knowledge diffusion. McCarthy's modification spread from VMF 213 to VMF 214 to the entire Pacific Theater in 6 weeks through pilot communities, not official channels. Bottom-up adoption based on proven field results achieved faster, more complete implementation than top-down directives could have managed. The implications for organizational design are significant. Formal hierarchies excel at coordination and resource allocation, but fail at rapid innovation adoption. Informal networks enable faster information flow and decision-making when survival depends on speed. Finally, McCarthy's erasure from official records reveals institutional mechanisms for protecting authority. The Bureau of Aeronautics couldn't acknowledge that an enlisted mechanic solved what their engineers couldn't. Doing so would undermine the credential-based hierarchy that justified their power. So they absorbed the innovation, validated it through testing, and credited engineering staff in official publications. The institution preserved its legitimacy by rewriting history. McCarthy lost recognition but saved lives. The pilots who knew the truth ensured his legacy survived outside official channels. These lessons remain relevant. Modern military procurement still struggles with the valley of death between field-proven innovations and official program adoption. Technology companies still debate whether to prioritize credentials or demonstrated competence in hiring. Medical regulatory agencies still balance rapid treatment adoption against systematic validation. In each domain, McCarthy's story poses the same question. When empirical results contradict institutional assumptions, which do you trust? The answer matters because the stakes extend beyond individual organizations. Strategic competitions, military, economic, technological, favor societies and institutions that can identify and implement effective innovations rapidly, regardless of their source. Rigid hierarchies that require solutions to originate from credentialed authorities lose to more adaptive systems that evaluate innovations based on results. McCarthy's 300-foot convergence proved this in 1943. Every advancement since has reinforced the lesson. Captain Sweat survived the war. He returned home with 15.5 confirmed kills, the Medal of Honor, and vivid memories of the sergeant who'd made his ace status possible. In his final years, Sweat gave interviews about his experiences. He always mentioned McCarthy. People focus on the aces, the pilots with the most kills, Sweat said in a 1995 documentary. But none of us would have survived without the mechanics, the ordnancemen, the anonymous sergeants who kept our planes flying and our guns working. Mickey McCarthy was the best of them. He saved my life. He saved hundreds of lives. History should remember that. History hasn't, not in any meaningful sense. McCarthy appears in no history textbooks. No monument bears his name outside that small plaque at the Marine Corps Museum. The F4U Corsair's legendary performance is attributed to its designers at Vought Aircraft, its powerful engine, its rugged construction, not to the field modification that turned its guns from scattered shotguns into precision instruments. The institutional amnesia is nearly complete. But among Marine aviators, the story persists. It's told in ready rooms and maintenance shops, passed from generation to generation, as a reminder that innovation doesn't always announce itself with credentials and formality. Sometimes it appears in the form of a sergeant with a wrench working through the night because the official answer, "It can't be done," isn't acceptable when lives are at stake. The F4U Corsair didn't achieve its 11.3 to 1 kill ratio because it was fast or powerful. It achieved that ratio because one sergeant looked at a problem everyone else accepted and refused to accept it. He questioned assumptions. He trusted data over authority. He risked court-martial to save lives. And he changed the war. 800 Marines came home because Mickey McCarthy knew how to make bullets fly straight. That's the weapon that won the Pacific.